Aloha, and welcome to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center's Take Leadership Talk. My name is Deidre Teagard, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, where our mission is to inspire people to find the hero within themselves through the legacy of our Nisei veterans. We're so thrilled to have all of you with us today to hear General Bramlett and his talk, The Nisei Soldier in World War II, The Price of Citizenship. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items as everybody joins the call. Number one, we do always take questions. So please feel free to write your questions as they pop into your mind using the little question and answer box at the bottom left corner of your screen. We will get to as many as time allows. Also, this is being recorded and will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel in about a week. So we encourage you to go there to check out this talk and other talks that we have had in the past. We also wanted to say a very big mahalo to our sponsors who made today's talk possible. So please help me thank HouseMart, VIP Food Service, Pasha Hawaii, Abbey Carpet of Maui, Maui Sons and Daughters of the Nisei Veterans, Arazumi Brothers, Maui Oil Company, Napa United Auto Parts, Service Rentals, Central Pacific Bank Foundation, and TJ's Warehouse. Again, we couldn't do it without their sponsorship. It now gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And I've got to say, we have so many wonderful people joining in the call today, so we're really excited to have you all. General Bramlett, a 1964 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, General Bramlett began his career in Hawaii as a lieutenant of infantry with the 25th Infantry Division. He retired on October 31st, 1998, concluding his military career as the commanding general of the U.S. Army Forces Command. As the commander of the Army's largest organization, he was responsible for training and deploying forces worldwide in support of theater combatant commanders. While in retirement, he has been a formal mentor and an occasional participant in seminars on security issues and international affairs. He has also been an adjunct instructor with Hawaii Pacific University in the graduate school courses in history and literature, and a regent of Chaminade University. He currently works as a volunteer on the management boards of several community service organizations on Oahu. His commitment to tell the Nisei story is reflected in his volunteer work with the Nisei Forum on Universal Values, the Go for Broke National Education Center, and in numerous speeches, both in Hawaii and the mainland, as well as in England. The 100th Battalion veterans in Hawaii have selected him to be an honorary member of Club 100. And he is married to Nora K. Harmson, DDS. So please help me welcome General Bramlett. General, thank you so much for being with us today.
I always respond when called. Thank you.
You're very kind. As I was saying earlier, we have just a lovely group of people tuning in today to hear you, everyone from veterans to sons and daughters of veterans, and from across the globe, including Japan. So again, we thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I know you have a talk prepared, and thank you for taking questions at the end of your talk. I know we're going to have a lot of people very engaged in this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I start the talk, I wanted to say a little bit about this talk. This is a very compressed version of a talk that I gave some 3 years ago in 2017 for the Freedoms Foundation, which was an organization that brings together 54 high school teachers from all over the country. And they come for a week. Their expenses are all paid, transportation, room and lodging, and they come from a series of seminars. And so I was invited by the Freedoms Foundation to come and speak about the Nisei soldier in World War II. So I put together, believe it or not, a 2-hour presentation because they asked, could you talk for 2 hours? I could talk a lot longer about Nisei soldier in World War II, but I figured for 2 hours, we should put together some PowerPoints. Unfortunately, my wife is much more skilled than I am, and we did this presentation. Now, what's interesting, when we finished, we asked how many of the high school teachers, history teachers there had heard this story. I'm sad to say, maybe 3 timidly raised their hand and said, we'd heard about it, but we didn't know the details. They were shocked, that's the word, what they learned about the Nisei soldier, and by extension, the horrible treatment of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast. And they were clamoring for information. Fortunately, I had a lot of material I gave each high school student to take, or high school teacher to take. But it reminded me of how that story has slipped away from history to a lot of our country. So I never pass the opportunity to tell their story. And I tell the story not as a historian, but I'm a soldier. And I have studied, and I've been fortunate in my life to meet many of the Nisei veterans from World War II to try to understand how they did what they did. And this talk, very compressed, is my effort to address that. Now, what you have before you, and let me check and make sure the screen sharing works. Is it getting through?
Not yet, but there's always a little bit of a delay.
Okay, let me stop here. Oh, I didn't do it. Screen share is there.
You know, it always works so well in the practice round. There we go.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, by now, many of you are wondering how I ever became a general. I couldn't handle this, but be that as it may, now we start. Okay, these are the units. These are the unit crests. And I only mention this, I want to point out a couple things. I used to have the 100 Battalion first. The crest is the little badge they wear on their uniform, because they were the first to form of the Nisei soldiers. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team came next in February of 1943. And of course, when they combined, they became the 142nd. Now, the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, actually, you could argue they were actually formed in November of 1941 when Sakahito and Komori went into some undercover work in an effort to determine the Japanese intent. But I'll talk more about them later. Those of you that don't recognize this gopher, that is a Minnesota gopher. That was their logo. It was designed by Chris Ishii, who was a member of MIS. He was also a sketch artist with Disney Studios. And of course, there's the crest, the more formal crest for MIS. And of course, I will talk about the 1399 Engineer, the less heralded of the Nisei units, but worthy of mention and worthy of tribute for all that they did. And I'll talk later about them. Now, the 10442nd, became the most decorated unit in our history, in American history, for its size and duration of service. All of you, most of you have heard that, but I stress the most decorated, not one of the most decorated, the most decorated. And you ask yourself, how is 0.2% of the American Army able to earn medals and decorations for courage and outstanding service? How could they, this small group of 16,000, I include the MIS because their contributions are significant. Many of the individual acts of heroism are lost to history because of their secrecy. But how could these 16,000, 0.2% of soldiers, have done so much? I've asked veterans over the years, and perhaps the most lucid explanation was Eddie Ichiyama, became a dear friend, and he and Ted Tsukiyama said much the same thing. But Ed put it best. He answered me bluntly, "We were a segregated unit." And I was stunned because of the connotation of segregation, segregated unit. And he explained to me, he said, "My son," he always called me my son, "you have to understand, we all had the same values. Whether we were raised in Little Tokyo or a truck farm in California or a plantation or an ethnic neighborhood in Hawaii, it made no difference. We learned from our parents, the Nisei that raised us, common values, and values that those of you know, and I put them there. And again, I won't go through all of them. I think you recognize them. But when we look at values, I think Gambari may be the most appropriate as we work our way through the pandemic. I usually use this slide at the end of the briefing when I talk about all the exploits of the Nisei. Then I said, how do they do it? And then I bring the values out. But I thought it best to start here because the Take series, the leadership series, its purpose is, and I quote, "How through the lens of Nisei values, we can get past today's obstacles." And I thought it was a reminder because as Deidre said, we celebrate the Nisei values. And let me talk about the obstacles they faced. We think we've had problems. Listen and let me reflect on what the Nisei values. Now, while they were living their lives in relative peace, whether it be in California, in the enclaves like Little Tokyo, or in the farms I mentioned, or wherever, or in Hawaii and ethnic neighborhoods and so on, these values were inculcated in them by their families. However, when war broke out, it was shattering to all the Nisei and the Issei because the distrust, the suspicion, the anger directed toward them had them persecuted and prosecuted in some respects. It was a very, very difficult time for them, and they struggled. And let me briefly say, let me start with Hawaii. On 7 December, Hawaii, the Nisei immediately responded with respect to the Hawaii Territorial Guard. The ROTC, the UHROTC, a significant percentage were Japanese Americans. They got the call on the radio during the attack on 7 December, report to the campus. The college students reported to campus. The sergeants were there frantically trying to find firing pins for the Springfield 1903 rifles, and they gave them the rifle, the firing pin in the rifle, and 5 bullets. By the way, none of the students had ever fired the 1903 rifle before. And they were sent into the high ground behind the University of Hawaii campus to repel the Japanese paratroopers that were rumored to have landed. And that was the nucleus for the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And throughout the ensuing weeks, the Territorial Guard, along with the Hawaii National Guard, which was a federal force, they protected critical installations in Hawaii. By the way, the UH-ROTC is the only ROTC detachment in the nation that has a battle streamer because of their response. Unfortunately, in January 19th, 1942, they were Japanese Americans in the Territorial Guard were summarily dismissed. These college students, despite their response, despite their loyalty, were dismissed. They were classified 4C, enemy aliens, not able to serve. They were crushed. They were feeling sorry for themselves, in their words, and Hung Wai Ching, an executive with the arms of the YMCA, approached them. He says, "Come on, you guys, get off your butts and present yourselves to the authorities and say you'll do whatever's necessary to support the war effort." And they did. And they became the Varsity Victory Volunteers. 155 of them initially signed up, and that number grew to 169. And you can see some of the activities. They raised bonds, but most importantly, they worked in whatever engineer task they were given. They all lived up there with an engineer battalion. They were considered auxiliary engineers. They dug ditches, they worked in dining facilities, they did whatever's were required. Actually, they worked at this from February 1942 until they were disbanded in December 1942 so that they could begin to join the active forces. Now on the mainland, a terrible situation. I think all of us watching are well familiar with Executive Order 109066 that incarcerated Japanese Americans in the coastal United States, Canada, and Alaska. There was an effort for the Japanese American shop owners, as you see in the sign, to try to make the point, I'm an American. I am not Japanese, but it was to no avail. And a lot of the property was sold on short notice at pennies on the dollar. And of course, as we know, the executive order caused the relocation of 120,000 of Japanese Americans. And here are just some photos. I think particularly our California friends have many more photos than I'll show here, but to give you an idea of how traumatic and dramatic the relocation was. They had anywhere from 36 to 72 hours to round up what belongings you could personally carry. And you can see the little suitcases, the bags, the duffel bags, and so on to try to move. They moved by a truck and train. And again, notice the soldiers ostensibly to protect the Japanese Americans, but in reality, obviously, they were guarding them. And of course, Minidoka was one of the 10 relocation camps. And I just picked this picture to show everything they could carry, everything they could put in a box, the family could carry, they could take with them to the camps. And the camps were not garden spots. There were pictures of 3, Tule Lake, Manzanar, and Roar. And there were 10 of them. And again, they were not in the garden spots of our nation, but the conditions were, as you can see, austere to say the least. Surprise to many in Hawaii may be that immediately Japanese Americans who were influential in the Japanese American community here in Hawaii were summarily rounded up. These were the Buddhist priests, the teachers in Japanese schools, the editors and journalists with the Japanese newspapers, the language newspapers, were summarily rounded up and put in such places as the Lanai City Jail, KMC, and I think they're going to put a plaque up there to commemorate that injustice. And they were essentially then consolidated at Sand Island and then relocated to Honolulu, which is a camp, which these are pictures. Those of you that have been to Hawaii or live in Hawaii, this is in a gulch northwest of Waipahu at the foot of the Wai'naes. And we think and estimate about 2,000 Japanese Americans were processed through this. Many of them were sent on to the mainland camps. In fact, a dear friend of mine was born at Tule Lake and lives here now. How did the 100th Battalion come about? When all this was going on, remember I mentioned the Hawaii National Guard, what to do with them? They were guarding the installations, and there were enough armed forces coming there that they had this National Guard with many Japanese Americans in it. And so General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, told General Emmons, the military governor here, take the Japanese Americans from the 299th and 298th battalions in the Hawaii National Guard, actually the regiments, and send them to the mainland for training. And they did. They took about 1,400 Japanese Americans from the National Guard and sent them on 5th of June, 1942 to the mainland. I have this picture just to remind you of the young Nisei. And again, look at who among us wouldn't like to have a 26-inch waist. And my wife said, what's the 13.5 inches? And that's the neck size. They weren't very big. And again, this is ostensibly and reportedly the shortest man in the American Army in World War II. That's Larry Kazumura, nicknamed Shorty, obviously. He's carrying an M1 with a bayonet. Now he is 4 feet 9 inches tall, and the rifle with the bayonet is 4 feet 5 inches tall. So he is 4 inches taller than the weapon he carries. And you can see the other Nisei soldiers here. And imagine they are, by the way, the rifle weighs about 10 pounds. So they're carrying arguably almost 10% of their weight just with the rifle alone, to say nothing. Remarkable, remarkable reminder of what these may be small in stature, but big in heart and big in courage, to be sure. They were, again, a segregated unit. They were all from Hawaii. They picked up some sergeants from mainland Nisei who were in the American Army, were immediately transferred to join the 100th Battalion. They trained initially at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and then finally at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Their officers were usually Caucasian. One exception, and I feel I must mention him, a Korean-American, young Oak Kim, was a lieutenant. He finished infantry school at Benning. They were going to put him in an admin job, and he said, no, I want to join the 100th Battalion at Camp Shelby. And he came in, and apparently Colonel Turner was the battalion commander, said, well, you know, Koreans and Japanese may not get along so well. And Kim reportedly said, no, we'll get along because we're all Americans. Well, he was trained at Benning, and he was pretty much, if not by the book, certainly strict. And the 100th Battalion nicknamed him G.I. Kim. But when they went to war and saw the courage and bravery and leadership, he became Samurai Kim, and a beloved member of the 100th Battalion and a great supporter of the Nisei soldier until his death a few years ago. The training impressed everybody. In fact, it was the training that they did along with the Varsity Victory Volunteers, remember them back in Hawaii, digging ditches, impressed all observers that maybe this is an untapped resource. And if I may paraphrase, if a battalion is good, wouldn't a regiment be better? And so it was the efforts in training with the 100th Battalion and the VVV that the 442nd got its birth. And I'm going to hold on that and talk about the 442nd later. The 100th Battalion deployed to North Africa in August 1943. Interesting, they were offered to the European theater, but General Eisenhower did not want the Nisei Battalion. And so General Clark, Mark Clark in Italy, said, I'll want them, I'll take them. And so they reported to North Africa and were attached to the 34th Infantry. And along the way, they picked up their motto, which is remember Pearl Harbor. The Army said, we recommend your motto be, quote, be of good cheer. Now you can imagine that for a motto for an infantry unit. They rejected that out of hand, and they said, we'll have the motto, remember Pearl Harbor. They landed in Salerno in this area, and then staged, they landed on 22nd of September, 1943, and they moved out and had their first battle at Castelvetere. I stopped there because that was the first battle and the first casualty. Sergeant Joe Toccato killed in action. He was a leader, forward, machine gun opened fire. He was mortally wounded. He continued to direct his soldiers and direct fire and saved many of them with his actions and orders. He died of his wounds. He was killed in action. And he was subsequently awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award our nation can give for bravery in battle, second only to the Medal of Honor. I often say this is emblematic of the Nisei soldier, the first to fall, sacrificing himself for his buddies, sacrificing himself with a great display of courage, and earning the nation's second highest award for gallantry. The battalion fought on with the 34th Infantry, as you see, up to Benevento. I pause at Benevento because that battle was one that came to the notice of the division commander, General Ryder. And they were, quote, mentioned in dispatches, which mean the report that went back to the rear mentioned the 100th Battalion for its achievements in battle. And General Ryder came out and said, you can now wear the patch. And here they're wearing the Red Bull patch. And this is 34th Infantry. They proudly wore that. And I'll go on to, they finished this particular stretch at Delifi. There was tremendous battle was fought. And just give you an idea of the ferocity of the battle. I won't go into the maneuver and the firing other than to say there they lost 21 killed in action, 66 wounded. They had soldiers stopping tanks by themselves with a single bazooka. They had Sergeant Sakamoto throwing hand grenades like baseball. He was a skilled baseball player. He broke up a German attack by slinging grenades at a greater distance to stop them. At the end they also fought 3 times on the Volturno River crossing. By the time they finished their first 6 weeks in combat, they had lost 26% of the unit to casualties, 78 killed in action, 239 wounded, and 1 missing. In the study of casualties and effect on units, normally at 30%, we consider a unit combat ineffective. Give you an idea of the 100th in Italy. These are pictures you've all seen. Now let me go back and just, the second leg of the 100's travails started back up toward Sassuolo, which is up here. There they distinguished themselves in great bravery. They had 2 soldiers side by side, Sergeant Alan Ohata and Private Mikio Hashimoto. To give you an idea of the courage and bravery up there, those 2 men side by side held their unit's left flank. They were attacked by 40 Germans. They killed or captured all 40. They then laid attacked by 14 Germans. They must not have gotten the word. Anyway, the Mikio Hashimoto and Ohata held. They killed 4, wounding 3, and forced the rest to retire. Not far away, Shizuya Hayashi charged a machine gun nest by himself, knocked it out, and then saw an anti-aircraft gun that was depressed to fire on the infantry, and he personally attacked the anti-aircraft gun, killing or capturing 13 of the crew and forcing the remainder to flee. All 3 received the Distinguished Service Cross, and 55 years later, their awards were upgraded to Medal of Honor, and I'll talk more. I will wrap up the 100's exploits by jumping to the Rapido River and Cassino. The Rapido River was flooded, and the Germans, by flooding, had created a swamp about 2 miles wide. And so the 100 Battalion had to attack over that 2 miles. And there were 4 drainage ditches, barbed wire with mines underwater, and then they had to ford the river in the 9-foot bank on the far side to begin to attack Cassino. It was a tremendous struggle. And then attacking Monte Cassino, which was a fortress, the Germans had fortified it because they declared it an antiquity because the Benedictine monastery, the Allies didn't bomb it. And so they could wreak havoc on any attacking unit. In the 100 Battalion pressed the attack, and the reporters covering Cassino dubbed the 100 Battalion the Purple Heart Battalion. An example, Company B finally struggled to reach a wall to their front in their attack. They had started with 187 men, they were at 14 left. And a battalion outpost started with 26 men, and they had 4 still standing. When they were pulled off the line after Cassino, only 17% of the original members of the 100 Battalion were still there. They had gotten some replacements along the way, always Nisei, they were about 40%. They then were moved back to Anzio, where they distinguished themselves by intelligence gathering. Lieutenant Kim and another private had actually crawled forward to get a prisoner, get 2 German prisoners. They crawled about 400 yards on their stomach, grabbed 2 Germans, drug them back, and they got a lot of valuable intelligence from them. General Mark Clark himself came down and personally presented the Distinguished Service Cross to young Oak Kim and to Private Akahoshi. The last thing the 100th would want me to say is they also were part of the attack, the breakout of Anzio. The last objective before Rome was Lanuvio, and the 100th Battalion reduced the German resistance at Lanuvio, but then were told to stand on the roadside, and other Allied units went forward to liberate Rome. And a lot of 100 soldiers still talk, when they were here, still talked about that. When they got finished there, they linked up with the 442nd. Now, how did the 442nd come about? I mentioned about the success of the 100th Battalion in training, as well as the VVB, and that the call went out for volunteers to form a regiment of about 3,500. And here are a couple of words from the call to volunteer. And here you were the mention of the 100th Battalion and also the Varsity Victory Volunteers. And this idea, let's volunteer and form for voluntary combat service in the armed forces. And that went out to both Hawaii and the mainland. The idea was, to accept 1,500 from Hawaii and 3,000 to come from the mainland. I should have said 4,500 men. With Hawaii, with family ties to the 100th Battalion and the desire to prove themselves, over 10,000 applied. On the mainland, you can imagine in the camps, the 10 detention camps, incarcerated, the response wasn't as great. And who could blame the young men in there to say volunteer? But incredibly, still almost 1,200 did volunteer, which meant Hawaii could take more. In fact, the Army took, and I have this specific number because I find it interesting, they took 2,686. Dan Inouye, perhaps the most famous of the Nisei, he was 2,685. He has said, I made it by one, where men beyond were sobbing because they couldn't go. But go they went. This is an iconic photo in Hawaii history of Iolani Palace before the volunteers for the 442nd win. And they did go and linked up with their compatriots from the mainland. But here we had a clash of cultures. You had the Hawaiians that wore their shirt tails out. They walked around slippers. Some of them didn't speak the King's English. In fact, they spoke Pidgin. And they became a lot of friction between notwithstanding ethnicity, the friction between lifestyle, education, perceived shortcomings on each side. And so you had the Buddha heads from Hawaii, so named by the mainland, because most Hawaiian Nisei were Buddhist, and it was a play on the Japanese words Buddha, meaning big, pig. And the Kotunks, so named by the Hawaiian Nisei, because that was the name the mainland Nisei had made when it was bounced off the floor after being hit by Hawaii Nisei. There was great concern, would this even work? Until they went to Roar. And the Nisei had family in the camps, as well as Anise from Hawaii, went on bus trip to Roar. And when Hawaii Nisei saw the conditions Roar and saw and realized what the mainland Nisei had volunteered to fight for the country, even though they were and their families treated this way. As Dan Inouye, I've heard him personally tell the story, on the bus trip back, there wasn't a word. They all thought, could I have volunteered if they had done this to me? From that point on, the 442nd was formidable. And when they linked up, then they were off. So now it was the 100th Battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 442nd, the 3rd Battalion of the 442nd. You ask, where's the 1st Battalion? It was broken up as replacements for the 100th Battalion. The 100th Battalion was allowed to keep its independent designation in tribute to its performance, its heroism. And so that's why I refer, and you could properly refer to the 442nd at this juncture as the 100th 442nd. And they fought their way up, and I'll not go through the battles except to say that at Hill 140, it was so ferocious that the veterans of the 100th Battalion that fought at Casino declared that to be the little casino. And the stories of bravery and heroism are too numerous to mention. And I'll talk about the Medal of Honors at the end, and you can take a look at look them up and read some of the citations. They went up to the Arno River, and that 40-mile stretch from vicinity of Rome to the Arno River, in 60 days, the 442nd, the 100 442nd, lost 1,228 men. That 239 were killed, 972 wounded, and 17 missing. So they lost 35% of their unit, but still they pressed on, accomplishing the mission. They were relocated to Naples and assigned to the army in France because they were needed to go to France to continue to help to push on the mainland of Europe into France. One thing I'd mention, the Germans tracked the 442nd. To our knowledge, the only regiment they tracked individually was the 442nd because they referred to them as the fearsome Turks, not the fearsome Japanese, the fearsome Turks. Know why, I don't know, but they tracked them individually. And that's why, in some respects, a lot of their exploits were actually kept secret because we knew the Germans were tracking. Now, why did they track them? You guessed it, because of their fighting prowess and their reputation. They go to France. This is the pictures of Italy. You can imagine they go from there to France. And they get there in September, and they get up in October in the Vosges. The Vosges is an area of France that's very mountainous, and it's a lot of trees, as you can see in the picture, and the climate's different. It's very cold, and they go there in the winter. They then, in about a 2-week period, they will fight, which arguably the most famous battle in the Nisei, the 100 442nd tradition, and arguably one of the, some people say, one of the 10 most significant battles in our military history, the rescue of the Lost Battalion. Now, what's lost to many people in focusing on the Lost Battalion, and I don't mean to not focus on it, but this battle takes place, and to me as a soldier, this is one battle. This is 14 days when they start to seize the city of Bruyères. Bruyères is a vicious fight. There are mountains around it. They had to take the mountains, and they had to fight house to house, cellar to cellar in the city. And then they continued the attack. This is Task Force O'Connor, and I won't talk about that. They go up to Belmont, is what we would say. They take Bifontaine. This is continuous action in difficult conditions, in terrible terrain. They continue, they go to Belmont, and they get what they think is a well-earned rest on the 20th, I want to say the 24th, 25th of October. And then because the first of the 141st Texans had been surrounded and threatened with annihilation, the general, 36th Division, they were attached to that, orders them out of your pup tents, put your boots on, and continue the attack. They did so, and starting on the 26th, in 4 days, they fought their way through difficult conditions. To give you an idea of how difficult the fighting was from Bruyères to the Lost Battalion, this gives you an idea of the forest. This is idea of the relief. My wife Nora and I were able to visit Bruyères and see the terrain. And as an infantry soldier, I would tell you, when I stood at the top of these ridge lines and looked back down and realized men had to fight up, I asked myself, no, I told myself, I don't know how they did it. As I sit here and look at this photo, I don't know how they did it when people are shooting at you, throwing grenades, and the Germans were masters of the machine gun. But this is what they fought through in Bruyere, Bifontaine, all the way, Belmont, all the way to the Rescue of the Lost Battalion. The Rescue of the Lost Battalion, this gives an idea of how ferocious the battle was. The top of the ridge line when they got through to rescue the battalion. The stories about the rescue are legion. It was all frontal assault, the nightmare for any infantry soldier. Barney Hajiro got 10 yards out in front of his unit, and essentially by his action said, "Follow me," and led the assault, knocking out machine gun positions as he went. So there were 3 medals of honor just on the battle for the Lost Battalion alone. There were 5 medals of honor total, including the fighting at Bruyere. And in the interest of time, I won't belabor it further, except to say this 14-day battle, and I consider it one battle. The Lost Battalion is the climax. The 10442nd lost about 1,500 to casualties, battle casualties, and another 200-300 perhaps to non-battle, trench foot, and non-battle injuries. I've seen the estimates between 1,500 and 2,000. So that's thus when the division commander said, "I want to thank the Nisei, the 10442nd, for what they have done," he wanted a formation. He didn't. That's all he got. And he said, "Where are the rest?" And the regimental commander said, "That's all there is." Now, when they finished this, they had a brief respite, and they had an assignment, but it was relatively tame. It was a chance to give them to recover, get some replacements. Then the battle was who gets the 10442nd. General Clark in Italy wanted them back. General Devers wanted to keep them in Italy because of what they've seen. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Crunther, who was the director of the Joint Staff, said one would think that the 442nd Regiment was the only unit in Italy. The fighting over, I don't realize another unit that had people fighting over them. Clark wins, they go back to Italy, less the 522nd Field Artillery. Many people think that was a consolation prize for General Devers because the 522nd was tremendous in firing, rate of fire, and accuracy of fire. They also, in their efforts, were liberated the camp at Dachau, one of the camps at Dachau. In fact, the 522nd Field Artillery survivors and survivors of the camps liberated by them would have reunions periodically over the years. And it was a tremendous event. I've talked to some of the 522nd, and they remember how important it is for them. When you go to Dachau and visit the museum, you will see the patch of the 442nd sitting in a display. There's no explanation. It just sits there in all its color. The 442nd, when they got back, they were assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division on the Gothic Line. And because they were a Japanese-American regiment, the division commander felt compelled to put out an order. And you can see these are some of the extracts. And I've highlighted the important ones. The division commander told the division, for these guys, orders are habitually carried out without question. They will all get up and move forward at 0 hour. And it's usually better to allow the squad or platoon to work out its own method of dealing with a particular situation. That was good advice. And the battle of the Rescue of the Lost Battalion, there are more than one incident where a leader of the Nisei just flat refused to do these orders that were coming down that were illogical and inappropriate. This was the breaching of the Gothic Line. This is, remember, the Gothic Line was the last defensive line in Italy for the Germans, and they held it tenaciously. The 92nd Division had spent 5 months trying to get through. They were not able, the 442nd shows up. They tell the regimental commander they were attached to, the division commander, after a leader's recon, they said, we'll be through in 45 minutes. What they did is they used an unguarded route that the Germans never thought anybody would do. And the 442nd, the 100th Battalion, went around, came up, and literally took apart that portion of the Gothic line in less than an hour. It was the beginning of the end. And of course, just to give you an idea of the terrain they fought through to the conclusion. Now, the decorations received by the 100th Battalion, the 442nd, 21 Medals of Honor, 20 were awarded on June 1st, 2000, 56 Distinguished Service Crosses. That includes the 19 that were upgraded, and so on and so forth. When in 2003, I was honored to be the speaker at the 70th reunion of the 442nd. And I gave a speech praising the success and the achievements and the courage of the 442nd. And I was approached by the president of the 442nd Club, Ichi Oki, a dear friend, and he said, why do you keep saying all this about us? We were just one unit. There were other great units in World War II. And of course there were, Ichi, the 100th, the 82nd, the 1st Marine Division, the 8th Air Force, and so on. I said, they're all great units, and I don't mean to diminish their achievement, but you must understand what you did is beyond the pale, that it was unique. So I thought of a way to try to convince Ichi that what I was talking about was important. So I counted up the regiments of World War II. And roughly, according to my count, there were 251 different infantry regiments, including the Marines, 18 Marine regiments. In the Korean War, there were 31 Army and Marine regiments. In Vietnam, there were 30 regiments. And I assume in the Civil War, for grins, 1,696. So I told Ichi, hey, out of all of these, 2008, the 442nd is the most decorated. Certainly in World War II, there were 251. They were the most decorated. I use that only to make the point. I'm going to hold the Medal of Honor discussion until if we have time for questions. I just wanted to, we'll go through the Presidential citations, Medals of Honor. I just want to make one point on the Medal of Honor now, and that is the bold, or the all caps underline are the camps. These are those soldiers who earned the Medal of Honor who came from the camps. And you see Heart Mountain, Minidoka, Roar, Tule Lake, Gila River, and so on. Incredible story that must be told over and over again. Now, Military Intelligence Service, less heralded, less known, because in 1972, they finally declassified what these Nisei did. There were about 6,000 of them served. They were asked to serve and actually go in the Pacific Theater, where they would be facing their ethnic, in many respects, their relatives. And in fact, there are stories where the MIS veterans ran into their schoolmates from, they'd gone to school together. They were translators, interrogators, interpreters, cultural advisors before that term was current. And they understood the language, they can interpret the language. For most of the American units, they had no Japanese speakers. They were formed in 1 November 1941. They started school, and you get an idea of the school environment. They went to Camp Savage, where they trained and were educated, and then they started scattering all over. They went in penny packets to units. They were everywhere in the Pacific. Every battle, the Aleutians, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, the Marshalls, Merrill's Marauders, and they were in headquarters, MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, in the Allied Translator Interpreter section. That's where they were. Their most famous achievement was the downing of Admiral Yamamoto. They had intercepted the transmissions, and they could interpret that Yamamoto would be flying on such a date and such a plane at certain time to visit the troops in Bougainville. And they were intercepted by P-38s, and this brilliant strategist, brilliant architect of the raid on Pearl Harbor was killed in the assault, with the effect on Japanese morale and the positive effect on our country's morale. They also were able to decipher some captured documents that showed all the officers in the Japanese army and what units they belonged to. That allowed the forces in the Pacific to track what unit they were fighting based on if they captured or killed an officer and could identify him. They, as I said, they served in a variety of conditions, usually 2 to 3 with a unit, either battalion or regiment. At the division level, there might be a total of 10. And again, all the battles they served at, we just don't know the things they did. We do know that, for example, Hoichi Kubo in the Battle of Saipan crawled into a cave and talked Japanese into surrendering, and also talked terrified civilians out of committing suicide. And the jump on Corregidor, the 503rd Airborne Regiment parachuted into Corregidor with the Harry Akune, was an interpreter who volunteered to jump. He had done one jump in his life, and he had to be given a weapon and a helmet in the aircraft on the way to jumping. There were Nisei with Merrill's Marauders. This is Frank Merrill, the commander of Merrill's Marauders, with 2 of his Nisei. They were legion. They were legendary in their performance. The 2 of the most famous cases I would mention to give you an idea was Roy Yamamoto that would crawl into a Japanese camp and gave them orders to attack, and thinking they were orders from an officer, they attacked right into an American ambush. Sergeant Kenny Yasui, actually swam the Irrawaddy River, walked into a Japanese formation, and coaxed them into moving into an American position. He identified himself as Colonel Yamamoto. I could go on, but you give an idea of how many stories we know, how many stories we don't know of the Nisei who were MIS. I tried to get some of them to tell their story. David Swift wrote a book on the first class, and he was trying to get some of them to tell things they did. They were given a vow, asked to be a vow of secrecy, and we couldn't convince them, some of them, that it was declassified. They could talk about it. I called one in Long Beach, California, and he was very polite. I identified myself. I told him of my position, and I assured him that the exploits of MIS in the Pacific were declassified. Now, he was very polite. He said, "Thank you, General, but I'm not talking." And so many of them took their stories to their grave. And of course, once it was declassified, trying to sort through that was very, very difficult. And just some more pictures. And I said they were with all the units. They were with the with the Allies as well. You see them with the Australians in the bottom picture. Part of the problem with the records of the MIS is we've learned the Navy, Marines, and Army Air Corps in the Pacific didn't keep records on the attachments. And so their exploits, we know the Marines had high praise for the Nisei from records and reports and letters. But in terms of decorations and recognition for what they did, we just don't have it. It's one of those great stories of courage lost to history. And of course, MacArthur said it best, never in military history did an army know so much about the enemy prior to actual engagement. And of course, his G2, his intelligence chief, and maybe hyperbole, but not much, they saved over 1 million lives and shortened the war by 2 years. And their awards, this is, I'm convinced, a pittance of what was earned by so many men in so many situations. Sadly, again, the records were not kept, and just their exploits were just unrecognized. They did get 1 Presidential Unit citation, and interestingly enough, you'll notice it was for the entire war. I have know of no other unit in the American military that got a Distinguished Unit citation, Presidential Unit Citation, it is what's called then, that award is equivalent to the Distinguished Service Cross for an individual. No other unit got it for the entire war, but the MIS certainly earned it. Now, let me conclude with the 1399th Engineer Construction Battalion. They were formed in 1944 in Hawaii as an engineers. They did incredible work here in Hawaii. They built barracks. They built a million-gallon water container. They were so valuable in Hawaii that when Douglas MacArthur requested them to come to the Philippines and assist in the conquest of Philippines, the Army said, no, they're too valuable on Hawaii. And so the 1399th served nobly and established a record, an extraordinary record as engineers. They wanted to go, but they were more valuable in helping do its construction work in Hawaii. They came home. This is a very famous picture. I think most of you have seen it, where Harry Truman said, the really has become immortal words. You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice and you have won. It was a terrible price of citizenship for the Nisei to pay. They paid with blood, with most of us take for granted. They, for reasons that you can surmise, they paid a terrible price to prove their citizenship, but they did, and they won. And their homecoming was joyous. It was not without problems. I mentioned Dananoy, his picture's there. And when he came through, he'd lost his arm in the battle in Italy, where he would eventually earn the Medal of Honor or be awarded the Medal of Honor. On his way home in 1947, he stopped in San Francisco to get a haircut, and the barber told him, "You're a Jap, we don't cut Japs' hair." Sad commentary, but the exploits of the 442nd, the MIS, and the 1399 really established a record that sentiment, that attitude has diminished and it's gone. By the way, in the Pacific, the Caucasian officers that served with the Nisei went up and down the West Coast to give talks on the bravery and courage of the 442nd. And finally, in November of 2011, they received the Congressional Gold Medal, and it was a lot of citations in the gold medal. And I've just mentioned 3 of them because they talk about the Hunter Battalion, the 442nd Regiment, and the MIS. And it was a signal, a recognition. It's one that was long overdue, but thank goodness some were still alive to be able to personally be there for the presentation and to be there and get the replicas that many communities purchased so we could give each member that was still alive or a family member a replica of the actual gold medal. And let me stop there. I probably went too long and we may not, I hope we have time for questions, but all I can do is talk.
We definitely have time for questions. We are going to go a little bit long, but I know our viewers are very engaged. And first of all, I just have to say thank you so much. It was both sobering and inspirational, and it very, very, very touching. So thank you very much. I do want to get through a couple of these questions that were sent in. The first one is there a reason why the 522 is not mentioned as a unit of the 442nd? Is it because they were attached to other units?
No, the 522nd isn't, I'm going to use a technical term, an organic part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And I'm thinking sometimes they are omitted, but that's a mistake. When I say the 442nd, I mean the 522nd, the 232nd Engineers, the Anti-Tank Company. That's all organic. And so when somebody is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team or the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team. I mean all of the organic units.
Perfect.
Does that help?
Yes, and I think here's a follow-up question from Peggy. Why were the 522 frontal observers not given infantrymen badges? A friend of hers was attached to I Company at the Lost Battalion battle, and told her that he hadn't received one.
Yes, I'm tell Peggy, I'm on your side. The artillerymen are artillerymen, and the combat infantryman's badge is by definition for infantrymen. And this argument has raged in the Army since World War II, and even in my experience, because the FOs, the forward observers, are right there laying right next to you as you do infantry things. Other than the idea is they do have a combat badge for artillerymen now, not in World War II, but that's the short answer. And again, Eddie Chiyama, who called me my son, was a forward observer. And so I had to look at him constantly and realizing he had been there with Peggy, and he didn't have the CIB either. That's not a good answer, but it's unfortunate I wasn't able to change it when I was in the Army.
Someone wants to know where they can go to get information about relatives who served in the MIS. Do you have a suggestion for that?
There is a club and a website. That would be, off the top of my head, that would be my recommendation.
Okay, and I know that in Honolulu, they have the Military Intelligence Service group. It has a very extensive website, so they might start there as well.
Well, I would be happy to help. Let me just say that you have my email. If that person wants, if she can send the name to me, I'll see what I can do.
Perfect, thank you.
No, because I really, anything I can do to help families know what their predecessor did. I was actually spoken at a gravesite at the request of another MIS to tell his son, the person laying there was buried. I told his son that his father had landed at Iwo Jima with the Marines and fought gallantly. Son never knew that.
Hiroshi Kato wrote in, he's saying the Congressional Gold Medal was very impressive, but it is a civilian award. Their bravery and accomplishments were in war. Can you explain this?
Yes, the Congressional Gold Medal is when Congress recognizes organizations or individuals that have done something so extraordinary in the country, in the history of our country. It's not necessarily giving just for wartime. There are, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of other non-military units that have gotten it, but again, it's awarded for their extraordinary achievements.
Christy Kobashigawa sent in asking how many camps were used as training camps for the Nisei soldiers?
They initially started at Camp McCoy and then relocated to Camp Shelby. That was 100th Battalion. The 442nd came to Camp Shelby, and that was their training only. MIS trained at Camp Savage in Minnesota.
Kyoko Kimura is saying, thank you for the great stories. I learned a lot. What do you think we can do with this history and these stories to contribute to world peace?
I think the message of the terrible carnage, the courage that was brought about by war, and this is the price of countries misunderstanding. I mean, I'm not a philosopher king, but I think when you look at the carnage and terrible loss that war brings about, that should be an incentive for countries to try to understand. We look at the tragedy of the bombing of Hiroshima. is often used is why would we come to something like this? And I think when you have the sacrifice of this relatively small group of men, what price they paid, surely we can do better.
I want to read something that you touched upon earlier, of course, but I'd just like you to comment on it. In World War II, there were 8,300,000 men serving in the army, 16,000 of whom were Nisei. No smaller group made such a profound effect on the US Army. No mission was too difficult to be undertaken. They remind us of our nobler selves, of what we might be if we reached within ourselves and faced the challenges of seemingly insurmountable odds. And our nobler selves, of course, our previous executive director, the wonderful Barbara Watanabe, was able to take that and create curriculum around that statement. And we use it a lot here at the center. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that idea of our nobler selves and how we can utilize that in what we're going through in today's climate.
Well, I think I hope I was sort of in my roundabout way trying to get to that with when you look at the obstacles that these men faced, and by extension, when I give the talk where I can see other faces besides you, of course, but when I talk about the families too, when nobler selves because of their sacrifice on the battlefield, but I look at the families being loaded up in trucks and trains and taken into camps, and then their sons and husbands and fathers go off and sacrifice. There has to be a nobility of spirit in the human condition that the Nisei tapped into. Now, whether it was the values that they got from their Issei parents, but they lived their values. And living your values would help you persevere. And if you live your values, and they clearly did. And they said, I've as a soldier, I have pondered this for 25 years since I met my first got around the Nisei soldiers. And they live their values. And I think to a degree that we can live their values, and hopefully I mentioned tenacity, but there's several of them. If we can just remember that's inside of us, is just let that come out more as they did. I mean, how's that for a fumbling answer?
It's a wonderful answer.
You're being nice.
No, we talk about our nobler selves all the time. And I remember the first time you came into the office here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, and I met you and I said, oh, our nobler selves, and I put two and two together. And it's something that is very important to everybody here at the center and all of our supporters. So thank you for sharing that phrase and allowing us to utilize it. We have gently come to the end of our time. For those who didn't get their questions answered, please feel free to email them to me, and I can email them on to General Bramlett so he can respond to you. Also wanted to let you know that our February programming is going to be all about, of course, internment, since it was Executive Order 9066 that was signed into law on February 19th, 1942, allowing for the terrible idea of internment. So we do have programming relating to that. You can go to our website at nvmc.org to see what that is. I don't want to take up any more of our time this afternoon, because I'd like to go back to General Bramlett for some closing remarks and closing thoughts. And again, thank you all for being with us today, and thank you, General Bramlett. But could you close it out for us today?
I will close it with three thoughts. One, I want to thank publicly my wife, Nora, because she put together that PowerPoint. I could have never done that. The second, you reminded me when I was at Freedom's Foundation for my 2 hours, I was followed 2 days later by a 2-hour presentation by President Franklin Roosevelt's great grandson, who was a professor at University of Pennsylvania, who spent 2 hours talking about the internment. So those history teachers got a double whammy from both of us. And lastly, I want to say thank you very much. And one of the great joys of my life were meeting these men who I admire so greatly. And most are gone now, but I had many years to be with them, around them. And they have reminded me, if I can coin a phrase, of our nobler selves. And I just hope to live up to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you all of you who joined in. We appreciate it. And until next time, we wish you well. Hui ho. Thank you very much, General Bramlett and Dr. Nora.
Thank you.